Welcome to the Arena Decklist Podcast. I'm Jerry Thompson, joined as always by Brian Gottlieb, and we've been playing hella Kaldheim, a bunch of different decks. Standard, in my opinion, is okay, but clearly has some problems. This is not the worst that we've had it, and I've been enjoying myself, but I'm also kind of skeptical about that because it's like, this isn't great Magic, you know? But I've played some really good games. A lot of it kind of depends on what deck I've been playing. But I don't know, man. What do you think about all this?
I agree with your assessment entirely. Things are better than they have been at the release of, like, certainly BFZ, because we had the Omnath problem. And, you know, we've trimmed a lot of the really problematic outliers over the last few months. So I am generally enjoying myself. I am enjoying the deck building process more than the gameplay. That's not really out of the ordinary for me, but I do think there is some, like, I still think there's a core fundamental disagreement I have with the shape of the game right now, where battlefields and hand size is just too large. Like, Magic is a game about resources. At least the way I love to play Magic, it's always been about resources. Like, think about the decks I default to, and, you know, control style decks or snowball engine type decks. Like, I am always trying to play a resource battle. That's always the lens through which I've viewed Magic the Gathering. Now, granted, that probably limits me as a player somewhat, and, like, certainly takes away from my capabilities. So it's somewhat of my flaw, but still, it has always felt to me to be the essence of the game, the resource exchange. And there's no exchange of resources presently. You just have all the resources you ever need, and you're supposed to learn how to operate within those confines. And when you have unlimited resources, it muddies what matters a little bit. You can make a lot of quote unquote good decks, but do they actually do the things that matter? In a lot of instances, the answer is going to be no, even where you have something that's totally functional.
Yeah, I mean, especially right now when everyone has, like, the best thing that a lot of folks can be doing is by trying to abuse an engine, right?
Yes.
So
yep.
It's weird that it's like, well, Magic's like kind of a resource battle right now, except instead of fighting over like a card or a half card, you know, just eking out those small edges, you're like, well, if I draw my Great Hand, I'll draw my deck in 2 turns.
Yep.
Versus, you know, just having some 4/3s and 1/1s and 5/5s attacking my opponent. So, like, there's a wide disparity in power level. So yeah, everyone has everything all the time. For the most part, you know, they're either using Into the Story or the Great Hand, now Showdown of the Scalds, Urian Blinks, and it's a little bit too much. This is probably a bad time to roll it out on mobile, I think.
It definitely feels that way. You know, it's interesting, though, because I always like to ask the question, is this a me problem or like a broader problem? And I'm open to the idea this is a me problem, because if you look at the growth of Magic and the success of, like, Commander is all about this style of play. It's all about having huge resources and putting together your engine. But, like, the goals of a Commander game are not the same as a game of competitive Magic. Like, you're supposed to be doing something entirely different, and it's supposed to be a showcase for these explosive moments. And in the past, you would do these things in standard constraints and it felt novel and interesting. But when everyone does it all the time, in a lot of ways, it's just not the same game. You're playing on very different axes, and very different things matter.
I agree with you, but I also don't think that it would be a bad thing to incentivize Commander players to get into Standard and vice versa.
No, I agree.
So I think that they should, you know, be somewhat different, right? And Standard should not have every deck kind of look the same. But yeah, I mean, there's also things like Modern, if you want a different play experience. Now, if you're talking about the stuff that you like, well, I got bad news for you. That doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I know. That's fine. I'm cool with that. I'm cool with exploring many things about Magic, and there's enough for me to love in Magic, even when the core gameplay isn't in the direction I prefer, that I'll get over it. I'll find something else to do. I'll build a bunch of decks and send them to people, and you can play them. Or I'll stubbornly play decks that maybe aren't the best decks and lose a bunch, but be like, okay, I'm losing my way. If that's what I have to do right now, that's what I'll do. And I'm cool with that. I like to share my assessment of where things are at. This is certainly nowhere near one of my favorite formats, but it's functional. It doesn't appear to be broken in any way, and the deck building has been fun. So
do me a favor.
I will.
Once You don't even know what it is yet.
It doesn't matter. I trust you. Hit me.
How can you commit to that? Now I'm under so much pressure. Once per set cycle, you should try to break the format or like build the best version of the best deck.
Okay. Yeah, I'm down for that exercise. It's not like I'm checked out from making a good deck. It's just I don't want to tune the Naya Adventures deck. It doesn't offer me anything.
I know that you're not checked out. Of course not. But I think that your chops are also like very well served towards that sort of thing. And if you are just like, well, if Magic is going to be crappy, I guess I'm just supposed to do the things that I enjoy so that I can, have fun on my own or whatever, versus participating in the system. And I would like you to continue participating in the system.
Okay, that's a fair request. So I guess step one of that is figuring out what's the best thing to be doing right now. And that's kind of our goal today. A little bit of review of what's happening presently in Standard.
Yeah. One last thing that I will note is that a couple times over the last week or so, I've been getting on Discord calls with a few people. And I had a session with Josh Show, and there were a couple people that bounced in and out, where I was playing some Boros Showdown, which I also wrote about this week for Star City. And I think the deck is quite good. But just being able to play these like small, white, aggressive creature decks and have my best friend on the line and be able to talk about lines as far as like, are we the beatdown? Are we playing control? Do we make this semi-risky attack with the Seasoned Hallowblade? Can we afford to like discard this resource? Where do we put our counters with Luminarch Aspirant? How many things do we attack with? Like sequencing with Showdown, all that sort of stuff. Like it was really cool. And granted, a lot of the games were like, okay, this is fun, but now I just showdowned you and revealed 3 spells or whatever, so you're super dead or whatever. But like the minutia of it was awesome, and I really did enjoy that.
That's a really good assessment. I was present for some of that. The minutia is definitely still there. It is, like you said, sometimes overwhelmed by the explosiveness and the engines, but that doesn't really matter, right? Like your job is to optimize your lines and figure out the highest percentage chance you can get of winning. And that will always be rooted in minutia to some extent. You're not able to escape that. I wish it was a little bit less about that and more about the grand game planning, but the stuff is there. The decisions are there to make, depending on the deck you're playing. I mean, it comes in, like you said, the experience is very different. If you're playing like Temur Ramp, I think there's far, far less of that, but the white creatures are good right now and they're pretty decision intensive too. And I've had a lot of fun. Almost every deck I've built over the past week and a half or so has been Showdown of the Scalds based. And there's a lot of small deck building decisions and play decisions that come around when you're building around that card.
Agreed. So with that in mind, should we start with this Rogues deck list?
Yep, that's where we're starting things this week. Heading over to the Magic Online deck lists. We like to do our deck dumps from time to time, and this week is no different. Looking at the Standard League from February 4th, I believe. Is that correct? Just published today?
Correct. Over the weekend, there were a couple standard challenges and another tournament. Maybe it was just another league. So I've already felt the effects of this playing on the arena ladder, where I play against a deck and I'm like, what the hell is this? And then I play against it a second time, and then I go back and check the Magic Online deck list, and it's like, oh, okay, now I know where this person got this deck list from. People are definitely paying attention to these deck lists, and I mean, this event only has 12 published deck lists, so it's not a lot, but usually when there are big tournaments, people show up and play in them.
Yeah, I think the best data point is always going to be the Showdown's premier events that happen on the weekend when it comes to the Moto decks, because it's actual tournament space. But those are a few days old at this point. I do think things change that quickly. That talking about 4-day-old deck lists would not really be in our best interest. So we chose to go with this league. But I do recommend, if you're trying to get your finger on the pulse of this format, you need to check out those standard results from the weekend. And of course, Star City Games is going to start back up this weekend as well with the SCG Tour Online. So that'll be another really good data point when it comes to tournament results for these decks.
Yes, agreed. So that in mind, first deck list from Glacier 7, Dimir Rogues. And I'm searching. I'm looking so desperately to find a new card.
There's not one.
0.
Swing and a miss. 0 new cards. But an important lesson there, I think. Like, this is just basically rogues from last format doing some of the tweaks that are not necessarily new. We've seen them before. 3 Lull Mage Domination main, 3 of One Mind. But this deck hasn't gone anywhere, people. Like, it's still good. It's still solid, especially in the hands of a really good player. And I think a lot of the deck building I'm seeing wants to ignore that fact, but you can't. This deck's going to be there.
Yes, and the first couple days of Kaldheim's release, I did not play against it very often, but as time went on, I certainly played against more and more opponents who were just like, well, I guess I'm just going back to rogues. Mm-hmm. And it's still a very good deck. I mean, they do still have an engine into the story. They also have their mill game plan with Luris, so there's a lot of stuff going on. They're coming at you from a bunch of different angles. They are also drawing a bunch of cards, have a bunch of interaction. Their mana curve is super low, which I really appreciate. And this deck is still going to be very good.
Yeah, I really like the combination of a low mana curve and disruption right now. You know, when people are trying to play things like Goldspan Dragon, and correctly so, incredibly powerful card, but do cheap stuff. That's how you can deal with that and have a counterspell ready to answer Goldspan Dragon so they can't get ahead in that resource game. And I think Rogues does a really good job of checking all those boxes. Not the sexiest choice, but if you already have a bunch of reps in with this deck and you have a tournament to play this weekend, you might just want to head back down this path again and use your knowledge to tailor this towards the metagame you'll be facing.
Yeah, you could do worse.
Agreed.
Mogged, mono green. This is more aggro. We have some Swarm Shambler, Stonecoil Serpent, 3 copies of Vorinclex at the top end, and 1 copy of Asika's Chariot as far as new cards. Nothing in the sideboard, it looks like, either. Oh, Snakeskin Veil, sorry.
Yep, Snakeskin Veil's on the sideboard. Love that card. What do you think I think of this deck?
I think that you think that it is a thing that you would probably never play, but I think that you think that it's also a good deck that is undervalued.
I actually love it. I love it. And I've played it a bunch. I know that's shocking because you're right, not usually in my range. But if you listen to us during Kaldheim preview season, you know I was high on Vorinclex. And I like the way these decks are being built, where they just have this baseline capacity to be aggressive. You know, they have the Kazandu Mammoth setups. Lovestruck Beast is always going to add some aggressiveness to the deck, but they have the engine of the Great Henge still present. And then Vorinclex is so good against so many decks in this format. It's doing exactly what I thought it would. It's about the defensive abilities. Like, it really doesn't matter that you're getting additional counters from your Great Henge. I mean, I'm sure people have definitely followed up a Vorinclex with a Stonecoil Serpent, and it feels great, but you just don't have to. It doesn't matter. The whole thing is you're shutting down Binding the Old Gods. You're shutting down Elspeth Conquers Death. There's so many good sagas seeing play right now, and Vorinclex being a strong defensive option. I mean, I'll be honest, a lot of the early deck building I was doing was just cold to Vorinclex. And even decks that I've been excited about this week, earlier in the week, like I spent time working on Urian Runes, which I was really happy with how it came out. But I left a huge gap in that deck when it came to Vorinclex, just because they were so reliant on sagas for removal. So this is something that's going to have a lot of influence over the metagame. And when you see the play patterns present here, this deck is actually a lot of fun. It's interesting. There's a lot of, like you said, those micro decisions come up all the time. And also you just have powerful starts. You can just go very early Vorinclex on the back of your Tangled Florahedrons and your Castle Garen Briggs. So I like having that explosiveness as well.
I spent a day working on 2 different mono green decks because I was looking for a shell that could maximize Vorinclex. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was excited about doing was Old Growth Troll in the food setups, because they're already trying to, play somewhat of a long game. And Witch's Oven into Old Growth Troll gives you a rampant growth basically whenever you want it. So that's another way to accelerate.
Very cool.
One of the things that I haven't tried yet is Blessing of Frost, which I also think is very good, but maybe it's too weak when you want to play 4 Garen Briggs if you're playing a bunch of Vorinclexes. Yep. So maybe that makes your blessings too weak. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. I only really experimented with that card in very devoted snow decks where it impressed for sure. It's quite good in those spaces. So I don't know how it changes if you just have your 17 snow covered forests or whatever. But I am a believer in the card in terms of raw rate for sure.
Yeah, and then this is especially one of those decks that could benefit from Faceless Haven, but again, maybe that's a slightly different deck because that doesn't work super well with Garen Brig, or if you're playing Old Growth Troll and stuff like that. So it's interesting that even within mono green, you have so many different options for ways to build your decks, and like they all seem pretty good, honestly.
Right. That's one of the great things about cards being super powerful these days, which they unquestionably are, is that there's a lot of really good cards that are not present in this deck. And maybe at some point it'll be correct for them to be present in that deck. And if you want to be like an archetype master and just spend all your time with mono green, you can shift on a week-to-week basis and really do a lot of stuff in an archetype that should be limited, right? Like you should just be a stupid green stompy deck. That's not the case at all, though. You have control over how much card advantage you have, how many answers you play, how much removal you play. All that stuff is really present in the metagame. So that's a very cool feature of deck building right now.
Yeah, the DFCs help a lot too as far as consistency and being able to curve out and everything. So
yeah. I really like the mana base in this deck. You're playing 29 lands basically, which seems wild, but this is how we envisioned these decks operating when we were in the preview season for the DFCs. We were just like, this changes everything. You get to never be mana screwed again, and it's going to be great. And it kind of didn't work out that way. But here's somebody going back to that way of building a deck and getting really nice results out of it. And you feel it when you play the deck. It just operates very smoothly every single game.
Yeah, absolutely. Next deck from Gracias por Tanto, Boring Gruul, I guess. 3 Goldspan Dragon, 4 Embercleave, 2 Great Henge, 2 Masked Vandal main deck also. 21 land with 4 Smashing and 4 Kazandu Mammoth. Like, pretty clean list, not doing any nonsense with, splashing Showdown or anything. Definitely sticking very aggressive with all the Embercleaves. Also has 3 Questing Beasts. So I'm down with this. The more I played with Gruul and tried to experiment and be all over the place, it was like, nah, just like streamline the deck, beat people down. That's all you really need to do.
Yeah, boring but efficient is the way to look at this. And I like the hard focus on Embercleave with Goldspan Dragon. I think that aspect of Goldspan Dragon has been underappreciated in a lot of ways, which is weird because Goldspan Dragon has gotten so much good press. If you saw the article over on Star City this week, they did a really cool feature. I like this quite a bit, where they had all of us put in our rankings for the best cards in the set and then tabulated the scores and figured out what was the aggregate number 1 card in Kaldheim. It was Goldspan Dragon. It's a card very much respected by everyone right now. But the sexier new homes are getting more press at the moment. The combination with Embercleave is wild, though. Like, you just produce so much damage out of nowhere. And this deck, that's all it wants to do. Big bodies, slap an Embercleave on them, win the game. Let's move on to the next one. And I can't fault that approach at all.
I'm really pretty upset about that column, though, because there were people who like didn't have Goldspan and Showdown in either like the top 5 or in the 1 and 2 spot.
People are allowed to be wrong. I mean, that's always allowed. I can't fault them for getting things wrong. I've gotten plenty of things wrong. If you look back at our list a week ago, we had Kazmina at the top, or Kasima at the top of our list. So, and that card has seen almost no play in Standard.
Yes. So you're allowed to be wrong, but it's like by the time you're writing that article and like
the information's there.
Yeah, the information's there, and it's very clearly those 2 cards, but you're just, I don't know, talking about how good Doomscar is or whatever. It's like, yeah, the card's fine, but like, what is this list that we're making? Yeah,
the top 2 cards in the set I think are indisputable, and most people fell on them, and they did finish 1 and 2 in the rankings. It was Goldspan Dragon and Showdown of the Skulls, and I can't dispute that at all. I actually had Showdown of the Skulls number 1, which I think that was a contested spot, but has kind of played out in the first weeks of the format. It does seem like that's the archetype having a little bit more success right now. I think long term you can make a good case for Goldspan. And I said it wouldn't surprise me to see those cards trade back and forth throughout their history in Standard, because they're both just incredibly powerful.
Right. And I mean, sometimes they're just in the same deck too. So
yeah.
Anyway, this deck is nice. I agree with most of what's going on here. Have you played much with Gruul, or just like even normal aggressive deck but adds Goldspan Dragon? Like
a very small amount. Like I did want to see what it's like just adding Goldspan Dragon to the default list early on, and it was fine. I mean, it doesn't really feel like it changes the archetype in any meaningful way. It's just another good card to add to the mix, which is acceptable. Not everything has to revolutionize what was already a very good deck. So my experience isn't deep, but it just felt like an okay addition to something that was already in the top tier of the metagame.
Yeah. The point I'm trying to make is Portanto added a land to most stock Gruul lists, which I definitely agree with and have not seen people really accounting for that. And granted, it's like, oh, you're playing 4 Smashing and 4 Kazandu Mammoth. Like, does it really matter? And well, you want your 5th land to ETB on taps, right?
Right.
So, I mean, there's also like RR considerations. I guess with 4 Embercleaves in the mix, like that's another thing too, where it's like, oh, well, maybe you want to go even harder on that. But yeah, these cards change the way that you have to build your mana bases too, especially if you're like splashing Showdown and all sorts of things. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, good point.
Sapoa, Rakdos, Sacrifice. I got thrown off by the Savai Triomes. I was excited for a little bit.
No, don't get too excited.
Yeah, this is pretty normal. 4 Crone War main deck, Embereth Shieldbreaker main deck. No Immersturm Predators.
Yeah, and also moving away from like the old Engine style Rakdos deck. This is way closer to Rakdos Sacrifice, I would say, which makes it even more interesting that there's no Immersturm Predators, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's Rankle instead, which is honestly pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
which is better, just in a vacuum? Which card do you like better?
I mean, Rankle is going to solo people far more often, and Predator needs a little bit of help, which this deck has, 2 Skyclave Shades. It has some Woe Strider tokens, but you're not getting the Mire Tritons and like Timur Calls the Dead zombies or anything. But this deck also only plays 2 Kroxa, and the normal Rakdos, like, casting Kroxa on turn 2 and not developing your board was a fairly normal play if you didn't have a whole lot to do. So I would expect this deck to maybe have more fuel for Predator on the turn you play it. So I don't know. Yeah. It feels like that card might be better, but it's close.
It's an interesting decision. I think that something like this is an important part of this metagame. There's some things I'm not in love with about this list. I think it's a little underpowered versus everything else you can do in the format. Like I talked about never running out of cards. This deck can run out of cards. It has some card advantage. It has Village Rites. It has things to play from the graveyard like Woe Strider, but it is theoretically potential. It has potential to get to the end of its hand, where almost no other deck in Standard will ever reach the end of their hand. So I would just do this in a Mardu style. I've been working on some Mardu Sacrifice-ish type stuff. I sent you a Mardu Pyromancer deck list yesterday that you didn't love, which I'm very offended by. Literally built a deck to give you a Mardu Pyromancer to play, and you just dismissed it. Didn't love it.
You sent me a deck list with Usher of the Fallen and said, "Hey, it's Mardu Pyromancer." All I said was, "These are not the same thing."
It is exactly Mardu Pyromancer. Hold on. Let's look at the comparisons here. Let me tell you why this deck is Mardu Pyromancer.
Hold on. Let me cut you off. We'll talk about your lovely deck in a moment. Okay. I promise.
Okay.
I've played a lot of Rakdos. I agree with you that you will likely run out of cards in hand, and that is the goal in a lot of instances because of things like Ox of Agonis or even like Castle Lochthwain, right? But you very rarely run out of things to do with your mana because you have a lot of stuff that you can escape from the graveyard, Castle Lochthwain, activated abilities, stuff like that. So it's a rare occurrence where this deck actually runs out of stuff to do. I mean, this one with only 2 Kroxas, not as much fuel for the graveyard.
Right. This one trends differently than the average Rakdos deck, I think.
It is. It's going to do that a decent amount more often than the actual self-mill Rakdos decks. But don't just be like, oh, you go Hellbent, you lose or whatever. That's not really what's going on here.
Sure. Definitely an oversimplification. All right. Now I'm going to yell at you. So I send you this Mardu Pyromancer deck list. Exactly Mardu Pyromancer. There's
now I actually have to look close to this deck list. Oh, yeah, Clarion Spirit. Clarion Spirit. Yep, got it.
Clarion Spirit is Lingering Souls. If you all want to see this deck list, you can go to my Twitter. I posted it there.
Can I discard Clarion Spirit to Faithless Looting?
Maybe you can. It's not a great play, but Clarion Spirit is your Lingering Souls. You have Village Rites for Faithless Looting. You have Showdown of the Scalds, which is Bedlam Reveler, because it draws you a bunch of cards, and then it doesn't give itself prowess, it gives everyone else on your team prowess, basically.
It costs twice as much mana, but sure.
Silence. Going on, we have Usher of the Fallen, which is Young Pyromancer, because it's just going to put a bunch of 1/1s into play. And in spots where
what is Clarion Spirit then?
Well, that's closer to Lingering Souls, because they are flyers in that case.
God. Okay.
So all of this combines into a beautiful, beautiful Mardu Pyromancer deck that you should be playing right now and enjoying. And then you get beat down some Blood Sky Berserker, and you just have these really aggressive draws. I actually think this deck is reasonably good. Like it needs some tuning for sure, but the idea of ultra cheap threats really getting paid hard on your Showdown of the Scalds and building these impressive battlefields and making Blood Sky Berserker into a real Magic card, which if you play with it, if you play with it at all in limited or even in like older formats, it's starting to get some love. I think the card is quite good and worth building around. And then there's like weird little cross synergies with like Shepherd of the Flock being able to enable your 2-spell turns in a lot of instances, and even using it to get mana back in some spots. So there's some questions as to how much you're supposed to be doing Claim the Firstborn Woe Strider stuff, I think, and maybe you are supposed to be doing more Rankle things to take advantage of all these tokens you're making all over the place. I could see that being, or even a Mercian Predator. Like both of those 4-drops are completely reasonable. I just wanted a really low to the ground, clean look at the deck on my first pass. And this falls under that list of decks I've been working on that are just like, what can you do with Showdown of the Scalds? How can you make the payoff even larger for an already incredible card? And a lot of what I've seen around deck building of Showdown of the Scalds, I haven't loved. There's just too many expensive spells in decks with Showdown. And I know you feel the same way.
My decks look great though, right?
Your decks look good. I mean, a lot of what I've picked up from building around Showdown has come from like the way you've put your decks together. I think it's important to make concessions to your mana curve. And I even go as far as doing something like Stonecoil Serpent, where like sometimes I play that for 0, and it's important to my deck. And that shouldn't be a common play, but the flexibility to just make sure you're able to always get everything out of your Showdown of the Scalds, and then really taking advantage of those +1/+1 counters. Like I've done some stuff with Naya counters and Conclave Mentor, which I think is really interesting, where you just go off when you have your Showdown, and people should look more at that. But there is some disconnect with how you're supposed to be building up around this card right now, I think.
I was interested in looking at those approaches because of Basri Lieutenant. I'm mostly off that card as a way to beat sweepers because I think there are just better ways. But yeah, I think using Showdown as a counters enabler is completely reasonable. What exactly is the Mardu Pyromancer analog for Stonecoil Serpent?
That is a good question. What was like the biggest scaling thing you could do in Mardu? Like what could go large and be a mana sink?
Are you going to tell me that like Looting's flashback? Because like that was the thing that you did when you were like way out of gas. No, you stopped, dude. You stopped at 4 mana. Like you didn't have to scale. This isn't Mardu. There's not really disruption. There's not enough spot removal. You're playing way too many things. Like Blood Sky Berserker, I wasn't trying to beat down in Mardu, man. That's why it's not a Mardu deck.
It's the future of Mardu. The future of Mardu Pyromancer. For a world that has grown cold to the loving embrace of Mardu Pyromancer, this is what it has to do now. It's what it's turned to in these desperate times.
It's like when Modern became a bunch of decks that were like, okay, well, now we're splashing the Eldrazi. Right. You know what I'm talking about? It's like, oh, here's my Death and Taxes deck now with Eldrazi, or like here's my, like banned Collected Company deck that now plays Thought-Knot Seer instead of Collected Company or whatever. This is kind of what it reminds me. It's like, yeah, the world has grown cold, and now you must play Blood Sky Berserker in your Mardu deck instead of Terminate or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and look, the comparison is definitely tongue-in-cheek to Mardu Pyromancer. And in reality, I think like this is probably closer to a Sam Black deck than like a Gerry deck. There's a lot of fiddly pieces and like using your creatures for value and getting really wide. What this deck's really going to need to succeed is some way of benefiting from a wide battlefield. Because if every deck can go wide and you go wide really small, it doesn't feel quite as good. So what mostly happens here is you end up making one large threat, and you play a little vulnerable to spot removal, which is a question I really need to answer if this deck's going to eventually be like a top tier competitor.
It's worse than Boros because you have Selfless Savior and Season Hollow Blade. So when you go tall, it doesn't matter. They can't do anything.
Yeah. Well, so the Naya counters deck, I still played Season Hollow Blade for that reason. Like it doesn't fit with the theme, but you're exactly right. You need something like that where you can just be a brick wall. And maybe that's what you have to do here as well.
Yeah, it kind of does fit with the theme, though. I mean, it's, Conclave Mentor is really good because it just chills there. And if you have things that are putting counters on themselves, then that's awesome. But yeah, if you have Season Hallowblade, you need a card to put counters on it, which is a little bit difficult. But I mean, like Showdown exists. If you wanted to not play Showdown for some reason, you could do Blessing of the Frost stuff. I think that'd be fine.
Yeah, I didn't really look at that angle. That's interesting. No, but I agree with you that Season Hollowblade, very important card in this format for sure.
Yeah. Big JC 00, 18 planes, 2 Castle Arden Vales, and a bunch of hits. 4 Luris of the Dream Den main deck.
Love it.
Hushbringer, Glorious Protector. Okay, so if you're playing mono white and you decide, I don't want to splash Showdown. Okay, that's your choice. I get that. You think that mono white just has it all. I think that you should probably be interested in more Glorious Protectors, but regardless, playing one is definitely reasonable. I appreciate it.
Card has impressed me. Whenever it's cast against me, it always does something good. I mean, it's maybe a little clunky, a little expensive, but there's no question it can swing a battlefield pretty dramatically.
I mean, 3/4 Flash Flying was, at least for the decks that I played, that was the good part of Restoration Angel,
Not anymore, Gerald. Times are changing.
I understand. I mean, there are things, you have Luminarch Aspirant, you have Maul of the Skyclaves, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that card. I think it makes a lot of sense in this format. And just being able to go Season Hollowblade into Maul is how decks like this can steal a bunch of games. The really smart thing here is the 4 Luris of the Dream Den in the main deck. I also think that was a question I was really trying to answer with the Mardu Pyromancer deck is, am I just supposed to be playing that card? And I wanted
honestly, probably.
Yeah. So the turning point was that I felt like I needed more ways to be paid on my Claim the Firstborn. It's why I ultimately went with Rose Shredder, but that could be a mistake. And maybe you're just not even supposed to be playing Claim the Firstborn. So I want to look at that. There's something very appealing about just playing a load of Lurises. Again, watching you play a lot of your Boros deck, you had main deck Luris, correct?
Yeah, I had 2 copies.
Yeah, and it was so critical in so many games and changed how you were able to play in so many situations that I totally believe there is a deck out there that just wants 4 copies of the card and wants to always be optimizing its plan around it.
Yeah, and we messed with that before. Just before the companion rule changed, it was just almost always better to play the one in the sideboard, and then you have, I don't know, Call the Death Dweller or whatever to just bring it back. And that way you just always had it, and you didn't need to play 4 copies. But in a situation like this where, how many 1-drops are in here? 14? Yeah, there are 14 white 1-drops, 4 of them being Selfless Saviors. Luris is good. My Boros deck has 9, and 2 of them are Giant Killers, which is, given the format, it's usually a spell,
Right.
And Luris is still solid enough there, and it's like, obviously you can return 2-drops with it and stuff too, but a lot of the time you are trying to stick it on turn 4 where you get to play it and a 1-drop. And especially with a deck like this, right? Like 20 lands. I mean, there's 2 Kibera takedowns, but waiting until turn 5 to play it and a 5-drop is kind of a tall order. So yeah, 14 1-drops. A bunch of them have lifelink. That goes well with Maul of the Skyclaves. Luris obviously also has lifelink. And then there's like this backdoor Speaker of the Heavens game that you can play with this deck, which
that's interesting.
I don't know if it's very good or not, but I mean, like Maul, Hushbringer into Maul with a Speaker on the battlefield, it's like you're going to be activating it pretty quickly.
You are. I'm not going to judge it until I play with it, and I'm never going to play with it because I'm never going to play this deck. But I can see the case for it. I can understand why you're trying to go to a longer game that Speaker of the Heavens enables, and the 4 Luris main plays really well with that idea as well. Because let's not forget, Luris has lifelink for some reason. Of all the ridiculous things it could do, it also has lifelink. So there's a lot of ways to take advantage of it. Usher of the Fallen has been such a get for these white decks. I mean, it's a subtle card. It doesn't really dominate any games, but just having that 2-power 1-drop changes how so many games play out.
Yeah, I will note that Glorious Protector lives in the sideboard of this deck. The other 3 copies are there, so that's great. Why didn't I try this card instead of Basri's Lieutenant when I was trying to beat sweepers? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
I don't have an answer for you. Probably hadn't wormed its way into your memory banks quite yet.
Yeah, but like when we were talking about it, it was like, yeah, this can save all your stuff from a sweeper. That's pretty good, right? Or if you get swept and your battlefield was kind of minuscule or whatever, it's like, okay, now you upgrade to a 3/4 flyer, right? So this card is good. I need to try this card more. Another card I want to try more. There's 1 copy of Sigrid, God Favored, in the sideboard, and I still don't think it's great, but I think that there's a lot of value to just playing like 1 copy.
Okay, just to make your opponents think about it. Put it out there.
I think you can get them. You know.
Okay.
One thing I will note though is that playing these Boros decks against Gruul, you really need to keep them off of the Great Henge. So a lot of the time, they play a Lovestruck Beast and I need to Cascade it immediately or Skyclave Apparition it, and I can't wait for them to attack me. And this works if they block with it, which is kind of cool, but I don't know. If they have Great Henge and you're attacking into them with like a Seasoned Hollow Blade, they're probably just gonna be like, all right, they have Bone Crusher or whatever. They're not gonna put you on Sigrid, but they'll be like, well, it's not worth the risk. I'll just take it.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases you'll be incentivized to just take a little damage unless you're facing real aggression, which is another subtle way. Like, I love the snowball of aggressive decks, and it's weird because I don't play a lot of aggressive decks in Constructed, but I do tend to draft very aggressive decks. And I love the way the early damage influences every decision your opponent has to make throughout the game. And again, something like Usher of the Fallen has a very small impact in that regard, where you've done a little chip damage early and where your opponent would obviously pass on that block if they were at 17. If they're at 14, maybe they start thinking twice about it.
Yeah, and if they're at 10 or something, like, well, maybe you just have to block.
Yeah.
Next deck is from Victor Saya. This is Gruul, but Splashing Showdown. So there's a lot of weird numbers in this deck, but a lot of them make sense to me. So there's 23 total lands with 2 Shatterskull Smashing and 4 Kazandu Mammoth. The weird numbers are 3 Brushfire Elemental, 2 Embereth Shieldbreaker, 2 Giant Killer, 2 Goldspan Dragon, 1 Scavenging Ooze, 2 Shepherd of the Flock, 1 Embercleave, 2 Great Henge. I agree with a lot of that stuff. I mean, I think that Showdown in a deck with Henge, Embercleave, Goldspan Dragon, etc. is not great. But as far as like getting the most power that you possibly can out of your cards, this is the way to do it.
Right. It's a weird tension. I prefer to build in the way that we talked about earlier, where you're just always getting everything out of your Showdown. But at some point, the cards are too powerful to deny, and you're just supposed to jam those 5-drops in there. And sometimes you run poorly, sometimes you run really well.
Yeah. I wanted to play Goldspan Dragon Sajiri Shelter because you posted like a mid-rangey Boros list, and I was like, all right, I'm going to iterate on this a little bit. So obviously, you're playing 4 dragons and 4 shelters. And I was like, well, I'm playing Boros. Obviously, I'm supposed to have Showdown in here in some numbers. And after thinking about it, I was like, I guess the number is 2, and I side the other 2 because you can't really play 4 with 4 dragons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where I started in my deck list. And then I played Showdown of the Skulls, and I'm like, nope, I want it the other way around, and I'll just play fewer dragons.
That's what happened to me too. I was like, look, dragons good, but I mean, if I'm going to be trying to do this powerful like mid-game type of thing, Showdown just gives you more mileage in way more spots. So I eventually just went towards building on that axis, right? But yeah, I don't know. Like this deck was basically the second stage of how I was building that deck, where I was like, well, maybe I do 4 Showdown and 2 dragons. Then it was like, nope, cut the dragons for grizzly bears or whatever.
Yep, get lean.
It gets super lean. So I don't know if these decks are eventually going to go that route. That's basically the Naya deck that we were all working on that Majors wrote about, where you're playing the Adventures cards, you're playing Showdown of the Scalds, and where that eventually leads you is Jaspera Sentinel, no 5-drops.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good question. And I also don't know which way we're going to end up when we get to the end of the evolution of this deck. And it probably is not ever going to solidify around one or the other. Like, you'll just float back and forth depending on metagame considerations or personal preference, which is fine. There's a lot of really good options, and that's how things work these days. This deck was kind of the poster child for my early in the show rant, where you look at how aggressive this deck is supposed to be. Like, it's playing 2-drop 1/1 haste creatures, and it has all these massive, massive threats. And then you look at how many cards it can draw, and it just has so many engines with Edgewall Innkeeper, the Great Henge, and Showdown of the Scalds. This beatdown deck will reliably draw its deck if you give it the time to do so, which is a preposterous spot for decks like this to end up in.
Control players, the Shaheen Saranis of the world, listen up. There was a time when I wanted to play like control decks with, no win conditions, basically.
Yep.
And then there was a period in Magic where Tarmogoyf was better than Doomblade. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I just play Tarmogoyf instead, right? Because instead of just killing one creature, it's killing all of their creatures, because they can't attack through it. And then there were like the matchups where it's just a 5/6 and you get to close the game really quickly. And then it's like, well, if that's the case, maybe I lean into like kind of the tempo-y aspect of it. And then there was a format, we talked about this a couple casts ago, I think like the Blink format, where Tarmogoyf, I played Tarmogoyf with Edge of Autumn and Flagstones in a deck that was like mostly creatures, and it was because it was like the best Doomblade. It's like, oh, this Bant Blink deck is a little bit too slow. I need help against the Rakdos and Gruul decks in the metagame. So you play Tarmogoyf, you try and cycle Edge of Autumn on Flagstones, or even just like cycle it on a normal land, ambush the creature in combat, whatever. It was the best Doomblade you could play, right? And a lot of the creatures were just like the best card drawers. You play like Aeon Chronicler and even things like Mystic Snake. It's like counterspell plus blocker. Cool. And this deck is, your Lovestruck Beasts, they kill your opponent, but it's a ruse. It's all a ruse. You're never trying to kill them with Lovestruck Beasts. It's like, I'll attack you, but realistically what I wanted to do is enable the Great Henge or make you spend mana to kill this thing, which will prolong your game plan, which will allow me to cast Showdown of the Scalds and outdraw you. And same thing with like Edgewall Innkeeper. It's basically how the Golgari Adventures deck functioned, right? And these Gruul decks are the best control decks, straight up. They have the best card drawing, the best removal, the best engines. Their mana is pretty good, and they have these weirdly divergent game plans where, if you have the beatdown draw with the Tarmogoyf for whatever, you take it, but it's not something that you're necessarily leaning into every time. And you look at how people sideboard with this deck a lot. Usually it's Brushfire Elemental is the first thing to go, like Brushfire Elemental and Embercleave.
Yep. I think that was an awesome assessment of where things lie right now. I love win conditionless control, but like even me, when I'm building control decks now, you just can't build them like that anymore. It doesn't make sense when these decks have those kind of capabilities. So the control deck I've been working on recently is like Nico Aris, Archon of Justice, Alrund's Epiphany, and then a bunch of control elements, because I feel like I need that engine. Like if you can do the Great Henge, then I need to kill you in one turn, basically. And that's what I'm trying to set up. I'm not just trying to sweep you and then play a Planeswalker and draw a couple cards. That's not going to get me anywhere. I'm not going to ultimately win like that. So,
dude, Archon and Nico work together, huh?
They do. They work really well together. And I'll post the list on Twitter after this comes out, because I don't think it's particularly good right now. So I don't want to mislead people, but I do want to share if people want to see it. It's an interesting idea, and it's more of a concession. Like, I have to do things this way if I'm going to try and play control. And it's got a lot of the pieces you would expect. It has sweepers. I'm actually playing Shatter of the Sky over Doomscar, which I know is going to be controversial, but I think it's like probably better right now for what that deck wants to do, because you need to do something more proactive on two. Like you're either playing your Omen of the Sea, or you're playing your Birth of Meletus to just kind of get the ball rolling in that fashion. But Thirst for Knowledge is there, which also, Thirst for
Meaning.
What's the new one called? Meaning. Thirst for Meaning is present, which also makes Nico Aris into like a reasonable kill card in a lot of spots. It's able to take out some bigger threats. So I've appreciated that. All these interactions, they line up really nicely with each other, and the point I'm trying to make is it's still not a true control deck, because if I just sat there trying to sweep you and draw cards, I would be dead before anything meaningful happened in the game. I'm looking to close the game in a very short window, and that's the way Magic is played right now. And you can jam your head against the wall all you want, but at some point you have to accept the reality that if the Gruul beatdown deck can easily outdraw you, you can't play the control deck. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, Gruul is the best control deck. Just play it.
Yep.
I mean, Boros is also kind of similar, where I have Giant Killer and Glass Casket and Skyclave Apparition, and it's pretty easy to kill, the majority of the threatening things that your opponent does. And in a lot of cases, it's mostly just keeping them off the Great Henge for at least a little bit. And in the meantime, you're like, oh, look at me, I'm attacking you, but you're just like, haha, I don't care, because I'm just eventually going to showdown and draw a bunch of cards and win that way. So it's interesting. I don't like it. I would like it if the kill cards were just Ember Cleaves.
Yes.
And the Edgewall Innkeeper dealt your opponent 2 damage or something.
Yeah. I am trying to very constructively complain throughout this podcast, basically. And I hope I'm doing a good balance of it, because my frustration should be clear to people. And I think they're shared by a bunch of people. But at the same time, there's no reason to just be like, this is terrible, because it's not terrible. It's just, it's different and it's weird. And it maybe is something I have to adjust to. But you can't deny reality once it's there.
Next up, SWB 110, and it's like this deck dump knew where our conversation was going to head.
Yeah, so, very well planned.
This is Dimir Control, splashing a little bit of green for Binding the Old Gods. We've seen the old Dimir Control list that played Urian kind of move in this direction, where now they're playing Binding because Binding is awesome. This deck is 80 cards. It does have a Urian in the sideboard, but this is, I don't kind of like tap out control. It's like Maze Mind Tome, Atris, 4 copies of Extinction Event. There are some counter spells, and then the top end is 3 Ugins, 3, because that's what you need to do. You can't grind people out. You have to sweep them and also still have a big thing left over. You have to really go over the top of them, and then 2 copies of Coma Cosmos Serpent. I didn't think I would see this card.
This card in play is way better than it reads. I'll say that. So I'm kind of into this card. I think it might have a home. I'm not into much else going on in this deck list. I came around on these decks when they started doing the Solemn Simulacrum stuff at the end of last format to get to Ugin. It made sense. The format needs an Ugin deck. If this is going to be the Ugin deck, that's fine. Now you're trying to do the same thing with Binding the Old Gods, which cool. I love this card. I think I had it as the 3rd best card in the set now, once I've played with these cards. So I'm with you. This is an important piece. But I would want to lean a little bit harder on making sure I get to Ugin, because it's really all you have against so many decks. And you're asking for so much to go right with this kind of fiddly mid-game. Just play some Solemn Simulacrums and max Binding the Old Gods and get to that 8 mana point, because that's what you're doing in a lot of spots. Let's not pretend otherwise. You're an Ugin deck, and just do your best job to get there.
I guess the rationale is that Binding kind of does Solemn's job, so maybe you can afford to play. You can afford to play some Atrices or whatever.
Yeah, but you're 80 cards. It's like when this deck isn't ramping, it's so ineffective at everything it's trying to do. I would play 8 copies. I would play the 4 Solemn, and I would play the 4 Binding the Old Gods, and just be all in on getting to the Ugin.
Yeah, I'd be down with that. And then this is 32 lands, which 2 Jawari Disruption, which also seems like a little bit light.
Yeah, that's a little light for me. I mean, Maze Mind Tome in some way fixes a little bit of that, but again, when you're at 80 cards, you just can't bank on that reliably. So I would like to see that change a little bit as well. There's something to this being a fine Ugin deck. I'm not trying to dismiss it out of hand, but there's just little tweaks that, if that's your identity, I'd rather you lean a little bit harder into it.
So Coma can't be countered. I already saw some tweets about that.
Mm-hmm.
Beginning of each upkeep, not just yours. So you're getting almost some immediate value. And I guess the sacrifice stuff is pretty solid. Maybe this card is just better than I'm giving it credit for, but I don't know.
I think there's some decks that really struggle against it. Like in particular, something like the Is It Tempo style decks have a nightmare against this card. They can basically do nothing.
Okay.
So it's a huge get there. And certainly it has weaknesses. I think maybe it's more of a sideboard card. Just because it has such polarized matchups, like you play this and Elspeth Conquers Death, you don't feel great about what just went down. But if you can find a spot where your opponent's playing a little cold to it, has a lot of potential to just be a super frustrating card to play against.
Tap target permanent. Its activated abilities can't be activated this turn. You can tap their lands?
Yeah, if you would like to do that.
Does that matter?
Go to town.
Does that matter?
I think it in more cases than not, it won't matter.
It's like the last turn, right? When you're on like the last push.
Yeah. And you want some number of serpents around to just kind of cover your bases and not get caught by double burn spell or something like that. But
yeah,
I think it's just more important to be able to slow down Goldspan Dragon and the fact that their battlefield isn't very wide. So you just stop all their offense, beat them down, and they can't really interact with this card in any meaningful way.
Aether Gust was the hero the entire time.
I know. There's been multiple cards now where I'm like, I miss Aether Gust.
I don't think I've ever gone that far, but
when Omnath was around, you didn't miss Aether Gust?
No, because Omnath would have played it.
I don't know, man. It would have. You're 100% correct, but at least you would have felt like you had some agency on interacting with your opponent's Omnath as opposed to just the race to Omnath we played for 2 weeks.
Yeah, we just had to put Dispute in all our decks. Yeah. Anyway, Ryuji, Boros Showdown. We talked a decent amount about this already. This take is a little bit different than mine, but is more in line with what I've been seeing, which is, for the most part, Bone Crush over Skyclave Apparition, because it's a little bit more aggressive. 2 copies of Goldspan Dragon, 2 Embercleave, 3 Maul the Skyclaves, and Robber of the Rich in the creature base. My deck has been leaner, no 5-drops, no equipment, very close to mono white, no Robber of the Rich. But I get this take. I endorse it. I think that this is a very good deck.
This is a lot closer to what I was playing early on in the format. And even down to like the Maul, the Skyclaves, Halvar stuff, which was super impressive in a bunch of spots. But Halvar was kind of one of the casualties of Showdown, where you just get lean, cut down the mana costs, and same with all the equipment, just less and less equipment. So I don't know. I like the idea of maybe just having one Halvar when you're convinced Maul the Skyclaves is still an important card. But like we said, just these decks keep getting leaner and leaner. Robber of the Rich has impressed, so there's some incentive for me to go in that direction, especially with Maul the Skyclaves. But you sort of already have your engine. You have Showdown ready to go, and you don't need to recoup cards all that often. I like haste. I really like the protectability of Seasoned Hollowblade, and these decks are very, very good. I endorse them.
I've seen maybe not like several is the right word, but at least a few people get burned by the fact that they had Robber of the Rich and weren't playing Snowlands.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I don't know if that's something to take into consideration. Ryuji has 1 random snow-covered mountain, and it's not even like there are any Fable passages or whatever to fetch it.
Yeah.
So, just for funsies. But yeah, that's something to maybe take into consideration. It's like there's like the mono blue snow deck where they're like frost augers. There's the Izzet deck where maybe you pick up a frostbite or something. So there's a lot of random stuff.
Just want to point to a couple of the sideboard cards here because they're not cards that I've played. I wonder if you have any interest in them.
One of them, I had to like reread the card and think about it.
Okay, so the 3 that stand out to me, the first is Bozri Ket, which was like a planeswalker that looked pretty good and sort of went away because there weren't a bunch of good small white creatures, but there are now. Any interest in revisiting this card?
If there were more ways to go wide, or like to give you bonuses for going wide, I would be much happier using the -2, but kind of like you pointed out with Clarion Spirit type of stuff, and there is 1 Clarion Spirit in this deck for whatever that's worth. But it's just like, all right, you make these tokens, but then what do you do with them, And then the +1, it's just so disappointing that it's not until your next turn.
Yeah, so you play a little defense.
Yeah, or even just like, all right, I'll bubble this 1 creature through a sweeper or whatever. If it did that, then that would have solved like my sweepers problem before, like the Basri's Lieutenant thing. I would have been all about that. But yeah, there's just like a lot of problems with this card, and it's not the numbers on it or anything. It's just how the format is.
Okay. Next card that caught my eye, Relic Robber. Haven't seen much of this card. I think you were high on this when it was released. Is that correct?
I thought it was 1R on my initial read.
Okay.
That's why I was high on. I was like, this card is like 3 power haste at the very least, and you're like, it costs 3 mana. And I was like, oh yeah. Never mind.
Okay, so I'm assuming not in love with it here.
Yeah, now it's just like, 3 mana, 2/2. The stats aren't great. Your opponent might already have a blocker for it. Even if you do get through, either you're dealing like a little bit of damage or they have some way to get rid of the token. There are just some matchups where it's just embarrassing, like the Village Rights deck or whatever. Obviously, you're not going to bring it in there. It does live in the sideboard, so maybe who cares? But I don't know. Even against stuff like Urian or whatever, it's like, who cares?
Yeah, I don't see a great matchup for this one. And then the final card in the sideboard, there's a Cosmos Elixir.
2 of them.
Yeah, so this card is interesting to me because I've been playing it in Karn decks. Like, in particular, my Pioneer In Search of Greatness Mono Green Devotion deck wanted a proactive 4-mana play I could make after using my Karn. And there just weren't many at that particular mana cost. So I ended up playing a Cosmos Elixir. And I thought it was pretty good in that role. But in terms of just like a raw card that I'm putting in sideboards, I really haven't considered it. Is this doing anything for you?
So at first I was like, oh, this is just like an anti-beatdown card unless you're, playing life gain or something. And I had to look at the main deck. I was like, this isn't like the mono white deck. There's not a lot of incidental life gain things, but it's like you just let it sit for a turn. Right? And that's all it does.
Yeah.
And then you're above 20. And then you start drawing cards. And it's like, okay, I kind of get it. I feel like there should be a better option. Maybe, I don't know, even the mono red decks aren't burn decks, right? They're Embercleave decks.
Right.
They kill you in chunks of 10, right? So like if this was like, oh, good against control and good against beatdown or whatever, I could maybe see it. But as is, I'm like, okay, I get what they're doing with it. I still don't think it's good enough, but I could be wrong.
I think this card would have been incredible 10 years ago, but based on how things play now, I haven't really wanted it unless it's something I could get with Karn. So I was very surprised to see it here.
It is interesting though. I mean, the funny thing about these Boros decks is like all the cards that they usually have in their sideboards, I just have in my main deck.
Yeah.
So like there's like Giant Killers.
Redain's the one that you always play main and I always have in my sideboard.
It's good against everyone.
It's very good. I know.
Okay. So yeah, my sideboard has Draneth Magistrate and like 3 copies of Draneth Magistrate and a Helios Intervention right now, but I'm not very high on either of those cards. But it was like, there's only like 10 cards I actively want. And then I wrote out the sideboarding guide and was like, okay, where could I benefit from having more cards against these decks? And there was like a slot that I could have made against Urian and Mono Green Food, where it's like, yeah, Heliod's Intervention is probably very good against both of them, right? So that's where that came in. And then Magistrate has been solid against Gruul, just like stopping them from casting their adventure creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And they mostly rely on Bone Crusher. Sometimes they'll have like Fire Prophecy or Scorching Dragonfire, but you do have Luminarch Aspirant and Selfless Savior and stuff like that to protect it if you actually care. And if they're splashing Showdown, even better, right?
Yeah.
And then they're like the Showdown mirrors, where I was like, I think I only want 2 of these. But it's weird to me where it's like, well, now there's this person is playing stuff that I hadn't even considered, like Basri, Relic Robber, Cosmos Elixir. So maybe I need to do a deeper dive on building the sideboard.
It's all about how you want to approach those game plans. I think given the way you've been building your Boros decks, I really like Draneth Magistrate because I felt like you were particularly empowered to play longer games and do a better job playing the control role. And in that spot, I really like you taking Draneth Magistrate and taking away Showdown from your opponents. So see where you're going with that one.
It's funny, though, because you strain a bunch of their cards in exile. And you're like, I want to play this longer game. But what Magistrate wants you to do is like beat down while they're disrupted. And instead, they'll eventually draw out of a way to kill your Magistrate, unlock all their cards, and then maybe you fold. So there's some tension there for sure.
Okay, interesting.
Next up, Game_Night. I think this deck is cool. This is Temur Ramp with Jawari Disruption and things like Fire Prophecy, a lot of Ugins. It's basically just like a spell-based ramp deck instead of Lotus Cobra, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, stuff like that. So they're Genesis Ultimatuming, hitting the occasional like Beanstalk, Ugin, Shark Typhoon. I love the plan of Genesis Ultimatum into a Shark Typhoon and like having it be good, which this deck does an awesome job of.
There's cool stuff going on here. is very, very linear approach to this archetype. And I've seen some other ways of doing this that I thought were interesting too. I've seen like Giants Genesis Ultimatum, which I think is cool. I've worked on a bit myself. There's weird things going on with some of the Giants where they don't actually trigger off Genesis Ultimatum, which is such a weird thing to me that only the Giants are finally having their entered the battlefield abilities constrained, but so be it. I don't know if Goldspan Dragon actually fits with these approaches. I thought this would be the obvious home for Goldspan Dragon, and I've been a little underwhelmed with it here. I think it's a better tempo tool than a ramp tool for the most part. But the idea of Genesis Ultimatum, it's just not going anywhere. It's maybe my least favorite card in all of Standard. In a Standard just flush with cards I don't like all that much, Genesis Ultimatum probably takes the cake. But something like this has to exist. An Ugin deck has to exist. So here we are.
Well, it's a little bit different, right? But like, how do you feel about, and maybe it doesn't matter because this isn't really a real deck, but Goldspan Dragon in big red decks with 4 copies of Ugin?
It is better there. So I actually played a bunch of big red. I was working on the archetype quite a bit. The difference is that there was a real beatdown approach that happened in those decks. And at least my version had like Bone Crusher Giant into Solemn, into Faceless Haven, into 4 Goldspan Dragon. So I was just stealing a bunch of games by beating down. And that's where I think the difference lies, is that this deck is basically Ugin or bust, and you're not getting as much from the 4/4 haste. And in that circumstance, would you just rather have another ramp spell? I don't know. It depends.
Well, the point is Goldspan Dragon ramps basically perfectly into Ugin. So, you know, say you play it and they try and kill it. Okay, your treasure's gone because you counter their spell or whatever. And then next turn you get to attack and play Ugin. And this deck, granted, only has like the Jawari Disruptions, 1 Mystical Dispute. So like, you could go that route where you play a bunch of dragons and Ugins and ultimatums and have more ways to protect your dragon. And I could see that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I might want to take another look at that using Lofty Denial and seeing what you can get to. And that's like a Lofty Denial Ugin deck is pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, because this deck has Shark Typhoon already for Lofty. So
yeah, and I think like playing Brazen Borrower in this type of strategy is completely reasonable. Maybe you're not Genesis Ultimatum at that point. Maybe you're just Ugin, but I would take a look at that. That sounds promising.
El Yalo. I don't know.
Nailed it.
I didn't nail it. Ellie Allo? I don't know. Mono Red, 18 Snow-Covered Mountains, 4 Faceless Haven, Frostbite Shock, Slaying Fire, Torbran. Oh, wow. I just realized no Embercleave because they're playing like Phoenix of Ash and Goldspan Dragon. I still don't know if that's right, but that is definitely something.
It's interesting. A lot more reach here than the typical mono red deck, and able to pull a little bit of damage out of your mana base as well with Faceless Haven, which seems like an important pickup for decks like this. A little awkward with like a super heavy red card like Torbran and things like Slaying Fire, but I don't think it's disqualifying. I think that's a big enough pickup where you can be interested in it, thinking back to like old style beatdown decks with Mutavault and how much sweeper protection it gives you in a deck which really doesn't have much sweeper protection. Magda being played here. I love the combination of Magda plus Shock and Frostbite.
Yeah, a bunch of cheap spot removal.
Yeah, and maybe that's what a lot of the other Magda decks I had seen were missing, because this was a card I played a ton of week 1. It was just in all of my decks week 1 and has fallen out of favor pretty dramatically, but I didn't think it was bad. It was just like a solid card, but required some very specific circumstances to make it work. And I think El Yalo does a good job of making it work here and then using it to get to the top end of Goldspan Dragon and really going off from there. I like Phoenix of Ash as a home for Goldspan Dragon mana because there's not a bunch of that here. Like you said, no Embercleave, so you're not getting that turn. But you can do stuff with like activate Faceless Haven and still play a threat. So there's cool stuff going on here for sure. The mono red decks I've played against haven't blown me away, but I haven't played against anything that looks like this. So maybe this is the way to do it.
Yeah, this looks interesting. I mean, you're talking about stealing wins from people with the Ugin deck, and maybe this is just a better way to go about that.
Could be.
I could even see like a sort of a mishmash, right? Or like maybe this sort of deck could even have an Ugin sideboard plan. Is that wild?
Okay, sure. That's a wild take, but I mean, I would just play a bunch more like Shatter Skull Smashings in that spot where you get a flex spot where that's both
Right.
spell and land, and then you're cheating all the way up to like 26 land maybe, and then I think that starts to work.
Yeah, Smashing's weird because it's not a snow land, and Haven is pretty greedy, and like Frostbite is too to some degree.
Yeah. I still had Shatterskull Smashings in my like big red decks, just because I think the versatility of it, you get paid regardless, even if that is a very greedy card. I'm still high on Shatterskull Smashing in this approach.
Same. Yeah, this deck is cool. I like this. Was having a discussion with a friend of mine, and Tundra Fumarole came up. And this is kind of like the exact sort of deck where you would expect it. It's like a bigger red approach, and you can use the mana to funnel it into Faceless Haven. Like maybe there aren't enough good sinks for it, but like you do have Magna Making Treasures, maybe Goldspan Dragon Treasures. You can pump Phoenix of Ash, if you have another red mana, obviously. But like it's one of those cards that you kind of expect to see here, right?
Yeah, again, it was a card that was in my big red deck, and I built around it in a lot of ways with like Maze Mind Tome. That's where I often wanted to put the mana from it, and my Faceless Havens, obviously. The real problem with the card is that when it kills something, it's incredible, but 4 is not always the number you're looking for. Like I just wish it did 5 damage. I think it's such an interesting card at 5 damage. At 4, it has its homes, it has its times to shine, but it's also really inflexible. It only does this one thing. It's sorcery speed. So there's a bunch working against it too. I think it really has to contemplate what the format looks like before you can get value from it.
Yeah, that's basically what I said, was just Lovestruck Beast, the end.
Yep. Yeah.
Slaying Fire.
That's a real problem for red decks.
Yeah, Slaying Fire main, Soul Seer in the sideboard, even like a Crowan War in the sideboard is sort of like a nod to Lovestruck Beast. So
yeah.
It would be cool to be able to play with that card, because I agree with you. It is sweet.
Yeah, maybe post Eldraine it has its home.
All right, maybe this is cruel and unusual punishment, but you have to try and pronounce this next name.
I think this just says "fuck you." I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, FAQUEIU.
I think so. I don't know for sure, but that's my guess.
That's so. I read it, and then before I tried to sound it out, I was like, all right, I'm making Brian do this. And then I tried to sound it out, and I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
So yeah,
sure it's fuck you.
I'm on the same conclusion as you. But that's a good screen name for this deck. They're just playing cycling.
Yeah, I feel kind of fucked by this. I don't really want to read this. It's not all that interesting. It's the old cycling deck with a Riel the Everwise, which is not something I think we did last go around, right?
No,
I don't remember that card seeing much play.
But now we're like pathway flooded and can just kind of do whatever we want. So
yeah, that's neat. I actually messed around with some cycling earlier in the week, but I did it with Showdown of the Skulls because I thought the deck really benefited. If you've played any cycling, you often hit these states where you're just like, I don't have anything left in my hand. All I have is lands.
Yeah, but it's so bad, right? Because all the cards you hit off it are just nonsense.
Well, so I rebuilt the deck, so that wasn't the case. And I didn't have any of the non-castable stuff. It was strictly Boros, no Boon of the Wishgiver, no Memory Leak type stuff. It's all castable spells, which means they're a bit worse, but it functioned. It worked. It just didn't really do anything to redeem the archetype, I don't think. So this one feels mostly dead to me, but the type of deck that could steal a tournament if the metagame works in the wrong way.
I think inadvertently the most F-bombs that have been dropped on this cast, by the way, except for maybe the episode that Majors was on.
Yeah, it's going to be a toss-up. We'll have to have someone run the numbers on those 2 episodes.
All right. Well, you said 3 so far. We have, maybe
still 5, a lot of time left.
Yeah, 5 minutes left. So, Rock Fort, another mono white deck.
That's a cheese, right?
Oh, I don't know, dude. I'm not cultured. You're asking the wrong person.
I'm going to Google that. Yeah, it is a cheese. A type of blue cheese, actually, it appears.
Yeah, I'm way off it.
Okay.
Love cheese.
I don't know why I got excited when a cheese showed up in the names, but that's what it took to really.
You're the meme that's like, hey, I get that reference, right? Like you're Captain America.
I guess so.
Faceless Haven, mono white. This is similar. I don't know. I guess this is like 4 Helvars, 1 Legion Angel. I'm trying to figure out how many cards are, I guess, like Snow-Covered Plains and Faceless Haven are different enough. Like, is that all it takes for Magic Online to post the different deck lists?
I think it's 15 cards, right? A 15 card difference. Yeah, I think there's 15 cards different here. I mean, this is a hard commitment to Halvar. Even like the snow-covered plains, right? Would that be enough to do it?
I don't know. I was wondering about that. Is that all it takes is to play snowlands and not snowlands?
Maybe. It's a good way to get your unique like Naya Adventures deck published to throw the snowlands in there.
Yeah. And just walk right into my Redains.
Broke it.
You fools. Yeah, I don't know. We talked about this deck. It's good. This deck has Giant Killer, which I really like right now. And it's a conscious choice to not play Showdown of the Scalds.
Yeah.
So
I think you're choosing like Halvar over it, quite frankly. And I get it. Like I had moments with Halvar where I'm like, this card might just be the truth. It is very explosive. You get to win games out of nowhere. So I haven't seen anyone really try and maximize this card. Rockford is the first person I've seen do that, and could be onto something. I'm telling you, the card impressed when I played it.
I think that it is impressive. I just don't think that I want to spend mana equipping things rather than doing Showdown things.
Well, I have good news for you, Gerald. If you read the second part of Halvar, God of Battle, you don't have to spend your mana equipping things. You get to just toss them around for free.
That's not true. It has to already be equipped to something, and you had to cast Halvar, which is 4 mana.
Okay, that's fair. It does have to be equipped to something. I mean, Maul cheats that a little bit, right? Like, this all works if you just go like 2-drop Maul Halvar. That's all the investment you have to make. But that assumes all your stuff's living, which Seasoned Hollowblade does a really good job of. Like there's good pieces for this type of strategy to work. And if you're not going to do the thing where you're playing Showdown of the Scalds, then you better end the game in these kind of burst damage scenarios. And I like doing this more than being like, oh, I'm a mid-range white beatdown deck and I still don't have Showdown of the Scalds. I mean, you should probably just play Showdown of the Scalds, but in terms of just being a pure white deck, this makes a little bit more sense.
If you have Hollowblade into Maul, and you have the option to cast Halvar, you're probably playing the equipment and equipping it. Because if you have a 2-drop equipped with a Maul, you don't need Halvar to move it around because you're killing them with the Maul.
Yeah, but Double Strike is so much damage. Are you aware that's double the damage you were previously doing?
I didn't do the math. You're correct.
That is twice as much. And that is a pretty large number, I have to say.
Yeah, but if you just equipped the equipment.
Double.
You would deal 4 damage. Okay, whatever.
Exponential growth or something like that.
Something like that. I don't
Stonks.
know. Yeah. Okay. What else have you been working on that you like? Real quick hits.
I have a lot of half-baked ideas right now. I wrote about a Urian deck this week, which I was very, very high on. It left some flaws by the time it hit publishing, which I'd look to address a little bit more. Main one being Vorniclex. Like I was just way too soft to Vorniclex. Not that they're everywhere, but there's no excuse for being that soft. So there's something to the engine of Runeforge Champion, a bunch of runes, Urian. It all works really well. Your endgame gets huge. You have this trampling, death touch, hasty threat you can put together out of nowhere. Setessan Champion's a real card. So I was really into that deck. It just kind of... there's a few individual cards it struggles with. And I don't know if you're supposed to solve those issues or just look to do something else. I still work with a bunch of Alrund's Epiphany decks, and it's kind of just a question of what the format's about. I believe there is a spot where you should just like generate some battlefield and close the game. I mentioned the Nico Aris approach to that, which I thought was promising, but still needs some more work. Nothing that I really like want to say, go play this right now. I think the default decks are very strong. I think the Showdown decks are very strong. And the more diverse Showdown decks will get more of my attention. Things like Naya counters. The ability to make really big bodies was exciting for me. The Mardu stuff is interesting. I'm not saying this is the final state of this deck, but being able to play like this weird aggro grindy strategy was really appealing to me. And you need to find something that it does a little bit better than either Boros or Naya, because those decks have a pedigree. They have super powerful cards. So all these decks need a reason to justify their existence. And I don't quite have them yet, but there's stuff worth exploring. I'm not like down and out on the format. And I think these decks have no chance. They're just not finished yet.
Alrund's Epiphany is a card that I need to work more with. For some reason, I don't know. I just got very waylaid by Jasper Sentinel and Magda and Showdown and Goldspan Dragon. And, some of it is like, oh, these are truly like, busted Magic cards. And some of it is
you
like,
found the best cards in the set. There's no reason not to be distracted by those cards. That's fine.
yeah, I guess. But it's like, man, those cards are like, pretty spiky, and not the first two, not Jasper Sentinel, but
Right.
but Alrund's Epiphany. It's like that's something that I should really care about and try to work on. And I'm disappointed in myself, Brian. I'm going all disappointed dad on myself.
There's plenty of time left in this format. You go work on it. Come back next week. Let us know what you found. I'm sure you'll get some good work in this weekend.
Yeah, fair enough. One last thing that I want to note is that in my article I wrote this week, I did have a sideboarding guide, and it, like, the fact that I chose to include a sideboarding guide meant that I had to think about what decks were important. And I would like to note those before we go because they didn't all show up in the deck dome.
Sure.
So in no real particular order, Gruul, Urian, this being more of like Gilded Goose, Trail of Crumbs, Binding the Old God, which did not show up. I think that is the best version. Is it Tempo? Luis's, is it Goldspan Dragon, Shark Typhoon deck? I don't think that deck's great, but it's done fairly well in tournaments. I play against it a lot on ladder. There are a lot of people playing it. Boros decks, by which I usually mean, the Robber of the Rich, Maul the Skyclaves decks, not necessarily mine. I think mine's better, but whatever. Rakdos, I've played against more sacrifice decks than traditional, but some of them are just kind of merging to be mishmashes too. So, whatever. Rakdos stuff. Mono green food, which, I don't know. We talked about like mono green beatdown, which I think we both like, and the food decks seem good. They should be good in theory, but they're just not. I would much rather, Blessing of Frost people or whatever than...
There's better engine decks than the food decks. So if you're going to take a half approach, then have a beatdown plan. That's better. And I think that's what you get by going the green beatdown routes.
Yeah, that's basically how I feel too. There's also an argument to be made that the food deck really wants to play Feasting Troll King, and it competes with Vorinclex. Vorinclex is the stronger thing to be doing right now.
I think it is, yeah.
And the last one, again, like I said, no particular order, was Rogues. So those were the 7 decks I was kind of thinking about. The 8th one that didn't really make it because I haven't seen any sort of consensus is Ramp, where Genesis Ultimatum is still a card. Even if you want to just do old school Obosh Temur Adventure stuff, that's fine. I think that there are better things to do with Genesis Ultimatum, but we haven't really figured that out yet.
How are you faring against Genesis Ultimatum with like your Redain plans? Because in most cases, I feel fine against that matchup using just Redain as my main concession. Yeah,
Redain's good until they decide that they want to be able to kill it. And, maybe when that happens, it's like, well, I'll play the Fourth Selfless Savior. And like Tybalt's Trickery is another card that you could potentially play against them, where maybe you can't beat Ultimatum, but you can beat a Terror of the Peaks or an Edgewall Innkeeper or whatever. So that's something to potentially consider. But I don't know. Those matchups are scary. It really just depends on how much they have to slow you down, because if they slow you down even like the smallest amount, they're probably going to get to resolve Genesis Ultimatum or Ugin, and there's not a whole lot you can do. And with Ultimatum, they're just rolling dice. Ugin is very difficult to beat. Maybe I need to look into Glorious Protector. So yeah, a few cool things happened as a result of like the podcast and looking at the 12 deck lists and talking to you and stuff. It's like I got a few more things that I need to think about. But as far as the Ramp matchup specifically, I just don't think you have to worry about it right now, but it will show up at some point.
Yeah, that's kind of been my take too. There's not enough of it that I really want to hard dedicate to it. So I'm comfortable using Redain. Also, like very small concessions have gone a long way. Like something like having Stonecoil Serpent in a couple of the decks I was building that should be super vulnerable because they do such a good job of generating early offense. Just having that one threat to make it through has been enough in a lot of spots. But I want to explore Angel. I think that's a card that I have personally not looked at enough as a way to play around Ugin sweepers, and I want to do more with that.
Yeah, me too. I like the card a lot. It has sort of the same problem as the things that we were talking about, where it's like the equipment are mana intensive. Goldspan Dragon, Great Henge, Embercleave, they're bad cards to flip over with Showdown. Glorious Protector is kind of the same thing. You can't foretell off of Exile. So if you could do that, then, who cares? It's basically another 2-drop, right? But you can't. So it's a little bit awkward and it's not ideal, but in those matchups, you generally want more big cards, at least against like the super controlling Ugin decks. Against the Temur deck, I did note this in the article, is that this is like the only matchup where I would want to potentially shave on Showdown of the Scalds, because you're just not going to be doing these late game things, and the counters and the cards that you get aren't going to push through the things that they're doing.
All makes sense to me. It sounds like a very reasonable approach to that matchup.
Game.
Good luck.